Welcome to the final part of the Ultra Deep Biosphere. In part 1 we examined the concept of the Ultra Deep Biosphere, in part 2 we examined the evidence, and in this final part we will have over an hour-long discussion with Eugene, talking about how he became involved in this concept, how he intends to take it further, and some of the intricate details of the concept itself. So it's fantastic to have you on here, Eugene. We've obviously done the videos looking at your paper, but before we get into the detail of that, I kind of want to pull you back to the beginning of the story, which is what I tend to do with quite a lot of people. And that's, how did you actually become interested in science?
Well, hello, Gareth, and thank you for having me here. And I think first two of your videos were kind of nice, so thank you again for interest in my work. And answering to your question, well, I've always been interested in science, like since when I was a kid. I was reading all kinds of books about science, about space, etc., etc. But at some point, I've got this impression from all these popular science books that space is sort of like dead, and there's nothing happening in there, and so I became kind of a little bit disinterested in it. Let's say when I was like maybe 11 years old. So I've switched on my interests to other things, but I was always curious about the world, But since when I was maybe 16, I became like heavily influenced by philosophy. So I started reading philosophy. But then, like maybe in 2014, well, first of all, I've had a thought, which I think is correct to this day, that to become a better philosopher, I need to study physics, first of all. So I went to study physics. I went to the university, to the faculty of physics, and I've graduated from there. But then in 2014, I've stumbled upon Thunderbolts project YouTube channel, which sort of reignited my interest in space sciences and in general, like alternative science, I would say. So since then, I've been working on various alternative ideas, etc. So this is more or less my story.
But you ended up going into research in Belarus. Can you talk a little bit about what that research actually involves?
Yeah, so formally, I'm right now writing my PhD thesis. So I've finished all the I've got my master's degree, then I've studied like three additional years to be able to enter this PhD program, etc. So right now I'm working on my PhD thesis in theoretical physics, in particular in strong interaction physics. That's like physics of nucleus and parts of nucleus, things like that. But that's my academic research. But I mean, beside that, I guess you might call it a hobby. I'm exploring all those kinds of things like plasma cosmology and like electricity in biology and those kinds of things. But I'm not a specialist in this area, like not a trained specialist, obviously.
But obviously very keen because, at some stage you must have watched some of those Thunderbolts videos and thought there's a logic in what they're suggesting that twigged. I mean, certainly for me, that's the way it happened, because obviously, I used to teach physics and you teach the mainstream, and it wasn't until I started to reflect on it and I saw some of those videos that for me it twigged. So what for you was the moment that you kind of went, do you know what, this actually makes a lot of sense, or a lot more sense than everything else that I've been taught?
Well, the kind of crucial point, like how I got there in the first place, is that I've watched Symbols of an Alien Sky movie. And I cannot say that any separate idea struck me, but it's that this sort of approach, when you combine different fields and they make sense together, that's what kind of struck me. And in particular, obviously, I'm talking about mythology and plasma physics. So that was a big thing, and well, it was certainly unexpected to me.
How did you then
So,
become involved with the Thunderbird? Because obviously a lot of people will know you from some of the videos you did on electric comets and recently the Birkeland ones you did. But how did that come about?
well, basically, it started from my message to Wall. So I went to the website, holoscience.com, I guess, Wall Thornhill's website. And well, I just wrote him a message like, hey, I have an education. I'm a physicist. Maybe you need some modeling to be done, etc. And he responded to me and he said, well, you better talk to Dave. So he messaged to Dave, and we talked to Dave a couple of times via Skype. That was like in summer 2014, I guess. And Dave invited me to this workshop they were having in November of 2014. But unfortunately, I couldn't get my visa in time due to various bureaucratic reasons. But I got the visa after workshop was already finished. After it was too late, basically. So I had my visa, and Dave said, well, why don't you come to our summer conference in 2015? So I did that, and he actually proposed me to present there, which I'm very grateful to him for. So I gave my talk there, and well, that's how it started, more or less.
So obviously the paper that you're currently writing, the one that we've produced the videos on, is significantly different from those two concepts. So how did you become interested in studying this concept of the deep surface microbes and the biosphere?
I wasn't even particularly interested in that, to be honest. Like, what I really had when I started writing the paper was just one idea, or maybe a couple of ideas, but they seemed logically connected, or at least there was a possibility I felt to connect them. And in particular, as I was, just randomly reading all the Facebook groups about the electric universe, etc. So I came across this news item in 2014 or maybe 15 about bacteria that can eat electricity, and that sort of stuck in my head for some years. But then I started thinking like, well, I started working on some of the earthquake-related problems. Like I was trying to figure out what kind of electric reasons could be for an earthquake to be produced. And I've kind of remembered this paper about bacteria, and I kind of just had this idea that, well, maybe it's the electric currents that kind of feed the bacteria, and bacteria produce earthquakes or something to that effect. So that was my starting point when I started researching the paper itself, which was in like August of this year. So I've had this idea maybe a year before, but I just didn't have time to work on it. So then I started researching, and then those, how many, like 26 pages of what I found out came about. That was like literally in September. Or no, it's more like August. So I worked on the paper for maybe 6 weeks or maybe 7 weeks, but it was very intense. Like each day I was reading a lot. I was writing a lot. And the paper as it is right now, it's actually like I've excluded some things, but you can notice that as you read, like somewhere in the middle, it starts being like super chaotic. There's just too many ideas per unit of length. It's just because I've had all these ideas while I was working on it, and like each idea, I start researching it. It like branches off to several other ideas. Each one of those needs research of their own, etc. So I've ended up like just piling all these different things at the very end of my document, to find them later, and I just couldn't organize it into any logical narrative at the end, so I just kind of added them as they were. So yeah.
Well, I think that's partly in also, I mean, for me, when I read it, the fact that there are so many different directions that it could take you, there are so many possibilities that it throws up that, I can imagine that the more that you look, the more ideas that come and the more you want to try and put into it. So to me, it sort of makes sense that it is slightly chaotic, because it's like it's opening a compressed can. All of a sudden, all these brilliant ideas just kind of jump out, and then yeah, it's then trying to deal with it. Now, one of the things in the paper that you talked about was the fact that these microbes could produce the hydrocarbons that we find in Earth. And do you think that actually the majority of our deposits may actually be due to that subsurface biosphere?
Well, I think that is a possibility, definitely. So that's what I state in my paper. I cannot prove that, nor can I disprove that, to be honest. So, well, unfortunately, it's more or less here at this point. But I guess I want to make a general point about the paper itself. Like, what I really wanted to say with it is to, I guess, introduce an additional object into the consideration of seismology and earthquake science, etc. So when people study earthquakes, when people try to propose alternative theories for earthquakes, they usually consider some of the factors like, tidal forces or electric charges or electric currents or, tectonic plates or things like that. So I wanted to add to this list of objects another object, which is this subsurface biosphere. So maybe like somebody who's going to do another research like a year later or 10 years later, they would, object and maybe they would be able to sort of connect the dots better than I did. But at least the object would be already there, so for them to work with. So that was my idea. But you can sort of decompose this notion into, or this idea rather, into two different statements. Like the one statement is that there is a ultra deep biosphere, how I call it, and the second statement is that this ultra deep biosphere causes earthquakes. So at some point I thought that maybe I should actually write two different papers on these two topics, right? Because they're kind of separate. But I'm now I'm glad that I didn't do that, because this first statement that there is an ultra deep biosphere, it was actually explored already before me, which I wasn't aware of. It was actually thanks to your video that in the comments to your video, I found that Thomas Gold, maybe you've heard about him, have already explored this idea. He has a paper from 1992 called The Deep Hot Biosphere. And I'll probably send you the link so that you'll maybe include it in the description. So I wasn't, and it was kind of embarrassing to me to learn that, because, I thought I would be the first here, but no. And it's actually doubly embarrassing because I cited other paper of Gold where he actually says that, he was the proponent of abiotic origin of hydrocarbons, since we're talking about hydrocarbons. And his idea with this ultra-deep biosphere was that it might actually feed on those abiotic hydrocarbons. So it was his idea of how it would get energy and nutrients, etc., is by basically utilizing those hydrocarbons. But my idea, again, is different here, and I'm glad that I'm glad that it's different, basically, is that maybe it's the bacteria actually that are producing hydrocarbons in the first place. And as far as I'm aware, Thomas Gold did not talk about telluric currents and like the possible connection of this ultra-deep biosphere with currents. And I think that it's a pretty important distinction, which is actually... Yeah, I just wanted to add that it's quite funny because Thomas Gold was actually one of the first who explored the electrical phenomena in the vicinity of Earth, let's say. He actually had one paper from 1965, I think. It was almost like in a newspaper, like a small paragraph, which said that lunar, how do you say it? Lunar landings are basically dangerous. There was an Apollo program already going on, or at least Gemini. So lunar landings were dangerous because the electrostatic discharge is possible between the lander and the moon. So it was his idea. And another idea of his was that during a very strong solar storm, a ionospheric current system might short out through the crust. So, and that might produce all kinds of havoc and like raise mountain ranges, etc. So I'm actually quite curious, why didn't he consider like weaker telluric currents in calm conditions for as a source of energy? But I think he didn't. At least I'm not aware of that.
Well, you look at it as a disappointment that someone else has done it, but I look at it that the fact that two people, come to the same sort of conclusion, not necessarily identical, but again, similar sort of concepts and similar sort of ideas from different directions, and the mechanisms might be different, but that still begs the question that this might truly be something that is out there for waiting for us to sort of discover it. So, I kind of look at it as a good thing. The more different people look at it from different angles, admittedly his is from 1992 and maybe not a lot has happened since then, and maybe it needs a new sort of refresh to move it forward. But one of the things you talked about in the paper was the mechanism for the earthquakes, and you proposed two different ways that could happen. Firstly, the slow build up and then a sudden spike in metabolism, or that it somehow is able to store that energy over a prolonged period of time. For me, the question then is how would that? I mean, I understand let's take the metabolism one first. So let's imagine that there is some influx providing these microorganisms with sustenance to cause them to metabolize at an accelerated rate. The question is, how does that then cause the earthquake? What mechanism do you envisage that would actually cause those plates to start moving across each other?
Well, first of all, I'm not convinced that the idea of plates is correct in the first place. Like in my paper, I think I prefer the term fault lines because it's sort of more neutral.
Yes, you do. That's
because,
true.
Well, like who knows what these fault lines are? Like again, one of the ideas that was, I'm not sure if it was Gold or it was Bob Johnson. Maybe you've heard of him. He recently, a couple of years ago, he proposed this. How did he call it? Gold scenario, I guess. But again, it was all about the CMEs kind of causing currents through the Earth's crust ultimately. But what he points out in his research is that these fault lines, they might be paths of previous discharges, and perhaps they haven't yet cooled down enough, so they have higher conductivity, and that's why the currents tend to flow through those pathways even right now, basically. So this is the idea, and that's why earthquakes concentrate in these areas also. But with regards to your question, well, I haven't arrived at a single scenario yet. So if the question is like how can the energy be focused or something like that, I mean focused in terms of time, well, that's a difficult question. Like again, maybe these fault lines act like capacitors of sorts. So one side of it is positively charged, one side of it is negatively charged, and perhaps like there is well, it might sound a bit far-fetched, but maybe there's like a biofilm in between them or something like that, which acts as an insulator or something, and then it shorts out. Or well, I can envision many scenarios. What I'm saying is I don't have a physical model, unfortunately. But one of the questions that somebody asked was like, how can you focus this energy in a single point, right? Because we have, let's say, well, my estimate is at least, or it's actually not my estimate, but some estimates place the amount of cells like 10 to the 29th or even more. But if they're distributed all around the globe, or at least all around those fault lines, how can you focus the energy in a single point? And that's a question. And I've been asking myself it while I was researching the paper. But at the same time, why I didn't say anything about it was because I've had doubts even about the idea of an earthquake focus in the first place. well, what is called the epicenter usually, but epicenter is the projection of the focus on the surface. But actually, where the earthquake occurs, it's called focus. It's just below the ground, but epicenter is on the ground, right? So why do earthquakes have a focus in the first place? I mean, let's say if we're working under plate tectonic paradigm, I don't think it's a very easy question because, well, plates, they're sort of like prolonged things, and if they kind of press against each other or something, why would that produce a sudden energy release in a single point? It's just very hard to explain, I think. So thinking about that and thinking that, well, maybe I should deconstruct the idea of an earthquake focus in the first place and show how maybe some alternative process might cause the same seismic wave pattern that we observe, because that's how we determine where the focus is, right? According to our models and the seismic waves. And obviously, you cannot confirm your model. You don't really know what's in there, right? So it's a model in the first place. So it was a possibility, or at least it is a possibility, maybe not for me, but for somebody else, to deconstruct this notion and show that maybe earthquakes actually don't happen at a single point. Maybe they happen at let's say a line or like a cylinder, like maybe 1,000 kilometers long or something like that, which eventually gives the same type of seismic wave pattern. But like it would have been a separate paper altogether, so I just decided not to include that at all. So basically my answer to this question is that, okay, I don't have an explanation for why earthquakes have a focus or should have a focus, but neither are any other theory. So
yeah. So we're stuck in a bad situation where neither can explain it fully.
Neither,
yeah. Because one of the things I thought about was because you talked about the fact that they effectively could generate some sort of an electric, I don't want to call it field, but let's say a current. And I wondered whether, you talked about the capacitance, whether they can actually drive some of that into the rock, creating a difference from one side to the other, which would be something, that would build up very, very slowly. And then at a certain point, it would only take a small amount to cause like a cascade. And then potentially you would have a point source, because wherever that short would then occur would be a point. But that was just my initial sort of thinking of because I struggle to see how the microbes could store that energy big enough, because we're talking, this is not small amounts of energy, that's big amounts of energy. So I kind of, my thought was to go to the rock, but I get your point that we don't really understand what the earthquakes are to start off with, so it's very much open to debate. But do you think that
but excuse me, like to finish off this previous question, I guess one other mechanism which also looks kind of far-fetched but still is possible, at least hypothetically, to produce let's say shaking of the ground with microbes is basically their own motility, their own motion. So again, I quote one of the kinetic motion, not even dealing with electricity in the first place. So I quote one of the papers there in my paper, which says that in at least one of the types of bacteria, they've in their colonies, they found what they call literally earthquake-like motility. So these bacterial colonies tend to demonstrate some sort of rapid, sudden types of motions. So that's another possibility, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Fascinating. Do you think, obviously it's still open to debate in terms of what the mechanism is, but that this could potentially lead to a better ability to predict earthquakes? If we there's a lot of ifs and buts at the moment, but if it really was a microorganism, and if we did understand it, then we would look at earthquakes in a different way. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. Do you think that that's realistically a possibility in the long-term future rather than a near-term future?
Yeah, I think so, because, well, it is now quite a well-established fact that earthquakes are associated with electromagnetic emissions of various sorts. Like, first of all, these ultra-low frequency or very low frequency radio waves. So we know that there are some charges that move there. And actually, we can detect them like several days in advance. So we just don't quite know, I guess. I'm not a specialist in this area, but as far as I understand, we just don't quite know what kind of pattern we need to look for. But like in hindsight, we always detect those patterns. You know, when we already know that the earthquake happened and we kind of search through the data, we can find some signals that well, basically precursors, as they call them. So, well, at least those types of signals would give us some sort of warning. Now the question might be, well, what does it have to do with biosphere? Well, perhaps perhaps we might actually do some experiments with the, well, let's say the samples of those subsurface bacteria. And if we would be able to reproduce some sort of, well, it might sound again very far-fetched, but radio emissions from colonies of bacteria of certain type or something, well, at least what I'm saying, I guess, is that we might try to reproduce the observations that we have from below the crust in the lab using the bacteria. That's the kind of pathway that I can see. And again, speaking about experiments, I was thinking about perhaps maybe I'll do that, I don't know, writing additional paper about like proposals for experiments, because I can think of at least 2 experiments that might be made in this regard again. So I'm not yet sure that it's a good way to establish those experiments, but what I was thinking was to, let's say, have a like a container with rock, maybe, and so that these bacteria that they actually take from, you know, like two kilometers below the surface. So these bacteria would be in the rock, and then you might try to send currents through this system and see if that initiates some seismic response. So maybe a shaking of like 1 micrometer amplitude or something of this whole box. So that's one possibility for experiment. And another possibility is kind of vice versa, because, well, I don't really know how it works. I just think it might be connected. So you might do the reverse. You might do the shaking and see if that initiates a current or maybe a really weak radio wave or something like that from this box. So that's another possibility for experiment. And what's interesting is that, again, I wasn't aware of that when I was writing the paper, but in some years ago, people have discovered that when you have a, let's say, a container with some loose substance like sand or even flour or something like that, and you shake it, and the like, so what happens is that the cracks appear, right, when you kind of shake it to one side, and when you return it, that the kind of this crack disappears, but then another one appears somewhere nearby. This produces actually voltage spikes around this thing with the amplitude of like 200 volts or maybe 300 volts. And nobody, as far as I'm aware, nobody really knows why that happens. Like, maybe it has to do with atmospheric electricity, maybe it has to do with something else. Like, there are various explanations. Again, I might send you the link to the paper, because so that's perhaps maybe that's also caused by bacteria. I don't know, but again, the kind of the other way around is possible, so that maybe bacteria actually feed on the energy on telluric current, let's say, and that initiates their metabolism. So they trigger earthquake through some other mechanism, like by moving a little bit or something, and like changing the electrical properties of the crust, etc. So I don't know, like there's so many possibilities, but at least those two experiments are possible.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, I mean,
I'm sorry.
you know, go for it. Yeah, no.
I'm kind of talking too much.
No, this is the point of it.
Okay, there was another experiment I wanted to propose, and that's specifically for those people who work with those ultra deep, well, not ultra, but like deep organisms, like two kilometers beneath the surface. So they keep complaining, and I make a lot of references to that in my paper. They keep complaining that you cannot grow them in a laboratory because they just don't want to give them. You know, you put them in this dish with sugar and they don't grow there, just because, like, well, it's the explanation of scientists that it seems like they just need much more time. Like they're, if you like, time constant is like thousands of years. You know, so each one of those bacteria are so ascetic in our sense. You know, they live such a long time that they don't even notice the food in some sense. But my proposal would be to try to feed them currents instead. So I'm not sure what exact characteristics those currents should have. Maybe those should be like very slow AC, like maybe a few hertz, or DC, or what kind of voltage, what kind of amperage, I have no idea. But that's one possibility. Like if we can show that by feeding them currents, we might grow them faster, well, that would be a big deal. So, and both for, you know, my hypothesis and for studying them in the first place, because, well, that would allow people to grow them in the lab and have, you know, enough samples to work with. So that would be mutually beneficial, I believe, in this sense.
Do you think?
So that's third proposal, yeah.
and there might be more. Someone suggested that because we, you know, one of the things you talked about in the paper is finding evidence of the existence of the biosphere is difficult because, you know, the samples that we get back don't show that there are enough of these to account for what we see, you know, and obviously the paper goes on to explain various reasons. But someone suggested it, and I hadn't really thought about it. Is it possible to find any? And I'm not sure that they would necessarily be fossilized, but evidence of them in plates, and again, you're going to tell me there aren't such things as plates, but in plates that have been lifted up. So, for example, if we look in the Himalayas and we see, you know, huge slabs of rocks with lines that are run in one direction, which maybe have come from deeper below, is it worth examining those for evidence of the fact that there might be microbes which once existed in the deep biosphere?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure if plates exist. Like, I'm not denying it. I'm just not sure. So I'm okay with this idea. But in terms of this type of detection or confirmation, then yeah, certainly I would say that it follows from my idea that we should find some, at least, hints that something biological existed there. But again, like when I've looked at, for example, the how they did those super deep drilling in you know, Kola, super deep borehole in Russia. So they've had actually problems with even recovering the samples at this depth, because what happens is, well, imagine you take a sample 10 kilometers from 10 kilometers below the surface. So the pressures are such at this depth that when you kind of try to raise it, it just sort of explodes because it's filled with high pressurized gas, and like it's not even a rock anymore when you pull it up. So this is what I mean when I mention in my paper that when you transition those things from there to the surface, it might cause such a transition of external conditions that, you know, rock didn't survive. Well, bacteria might also not survive it, but still, maybe they can. I don't know. At the moment, well, I'm telling you, I was studying this, and like I was more and more amazed of how retarded our theoretical understanding of biology is with respect to our observations. Like almost each paper says, well, okay, the limit for life is like 120 Celsius. But then a paper comes out that says, well, we found life that can sustain 420. So like it's 3 times more than the theoretical limit. So and even that limit at 120, it's poorly understood. Like again, theoretical studies says that lipids shouldn't work, like your membranes shouldn't work, your ATP synthesis shouldn't work at this temperature, etc. But somehow, life just doesn't care. It seems so, at least. And again, it can survive at some incredible accelerations. So I'm not sure the exact figure, but it's like tens of thousands of G. It was experimentally demonstrated, and I have a reference in my paper. I just forgot the exact figure. I think it was like 40,000 G or something. And cells can actually divide at these accelerations. So again,
that's insane. That's absolutely insane.
That's absolutely insane.
Yeah.
So my current understanding of life on Earth is that it's basically indestructible. Like you can literally blow the planet
except
apart.
For us. We're poorly made.
No, I mean life, including
I know.
all the species. So if you literally blow the planet apart, life would still be there in one of those pieces. It would still remain. So, well, that's my current understanding. But again, returning to that question, yeah, I would say that definitely my prediction, if you like, is that we should find more samples of let's say, biological tissues or something like that.
In those older
as we drill deeper and deeper, maybe not more and more, but we should find something. There's an interesting question about, well, what if life itself at these depths is not the kind of life that we know, but it's sort of kind of already dives into sci-fi. So I tried to not talk about it much, but at the same time, people speak about silicon-based to carbon, and people say, well, it's not stable. Well, it might not be stable in our conditions, but what about the deep crust? Maybe silica behaves better there, or something. And again, speaking about transmutations and all kinds of stuff like that, like silicon and carbon, that they are also related. This idea that we can get basically oxides of silicon from CO2 or CO, I don't exactly remember, through some transmutations. But that's, again, a whole separate rabbit hole. Even though I mentioned in my paper that, I referenced the recent review of biogenic transmutations by Biberian, Jean-Paul Biberian. But yeah.
But I guess we would have to find evidence of, though. I mean, in theory, even if it's silicon-based, it should still, I'm guessing, operate in a similar way to a normal microbe. As in, it would look like something like a cell, but it would just consist of different materials. But then, I guess, who knows, really? But that would have to be our starting assumption, I guess. So I guess the problem is that when they pull these samples out, they're not looking for that. They're not, although I suppose the problem at the moment is that not much of it's left from those depths. In order for it to survive, you've got to overcome that pressure difference. But yeah. The other thing I found really interesting was the whole concept of the endospores, and the fact that these endospores can end up in the atmosphere, and then from the atmosphere can then travel outwards. And to me, that's another way that we could potentially test. I guess it depends on numbers. How many endospores do we think would end up in the atmosphere? But it should be relatively simple to build some sort of a filter to be able to measure endospores high up in the atmosphere.
So is that a question?
Well, yeah, that's a
as far
so. I mean, obviously, it doesn't necessarily prove where they came from, but I'm not sure to date that we know particularly well how many endospores end up high up in the atmosphere.
Yeah, it's certainly a sort of like a novel area, but I think I reference a few papers that actually say, well, they're everywhere, like in the atmosphere, etc. There's this fancy species of bacteria that actually causes cloud condensation, and that's again a whole separate topic. I kind of it was kind of off topic for my paper, but I decided to include it just because I stumbled upon it and I was so fascinated with it. You know how atmospheric bacteria and bacteria on the surfaces of oceans, how much of a role they might actually play in the whole climate thing. Because, well, one paper that I found says that the presence of bacteria on the surface of the ocean influences the rate of evaporation quite a lot. So that's one huge thing for the whole planet, basically. So and another thing that I found was that there are these, well, at least one species that is known, which are present even in like the stratosphere. So that's like maybe 50 kilometers up at least, or maybe, I don't know, well somewhere there, let's say. And plus, some of the bacteria, at least one species, are able to kind of nucleate clouds. So they are able to induce extra condensation and cause like snow or rain or something like that. And one of the interesting, and it was actually this concept of bioprecipitation that was proposed in like 70s, I guess, and it was later proven that this is the case. It was because one guy somewhere in the US noticed that when the snow falls or rain falls, after that, his plants, I'm not sure what they were, like trees or something, they get damaged with this harmful bacteria. And he kind of thought that maybe this bacteria arrives with the rain. And he thought that maybe the bacteria actually induced the rain in the first place. And that was correct. I mean, after that, like right now, these particular species are used to create artificial snow. So it's like proven by engineering, so to speak, that it works. But the explanation for that, the one that I've come up, the one that I've found at least, was that they use it to spread more efficiently across the surface. So what they do is they get up with some updraft, they get into some cyclone, they produce rain there, and the rain kind of falls somewhere else. So that's their way of transportation, basically, from certain plants to other plants, because as I've said, they're harmful to plants in the first place. But it's a very interesting mechanism.
Yeah, that's an amazing mechanism, because that's transportation over a vast distance for such a small creature.
Yeah, absolutely. And so again, as far as I'm aware, they are everywhere, those bacteria, and there's like a whole bunch of viruses everywhere. Like viruses are at the bottoms of the oceans. They're at everywhere, and those endospores, they're also in oceans worldwide. And there is some debate as to where they come from, because, well, basically, some people propose to use these endospores to track oceanic currents, because I don't quite remember, but I think there is some difference in their distribution across the world. Like maybe some genetic differences are there, but some people definitely propose to use endospores as trackers of currents. That much I can remember, at least. So yeah, well, life is everywhere, basically. That's another point.
That's definitely one of the other things you also talked about, was the fact that, when we look at plant life, we sort of assume they use light, and you talked about the fact that they constitute the majority of the energy creators on the surface. But obviously there is another stream that the sun gives off, which is the solar wind, the charged particles. and it would be foolish for us to ignore the fact that particles might adapt to actually consume some of that. Now, the question is how much of those, because we know obviously that the solar wind, sort of flows in at the poles where it follows the lines of the magnetic field. Would that not create an uneven distribution within the biosphere, because you then have the charges which would be more based in the poles rather than around the equator?
Okay, so that is indeed an idea that I've described in my paper. I mean, the whole idea that we have solar radiation, which plants use, and we have telluric currents, or whatever types of currents, which nobody seems to use, So it seems very strange that plants have adapted to use radiation, and they constitute the largest reservoir of biomass, at least that we know of, on the planet. It's like maybe 70% of biomass is plants. I'm not sure. Something like that. It's
in your
figure.
paper, I remember. You do mention it.
Yeah. So, but what about this other thing? So I've proposed that, yeah, maybe it's the currents that are feeding those bacteria, at least giving them energy. So with regards to your statement that these currents kind of flow through the poles, well, those are like one type of currents. And this is like specifically what we're talking about, is that the magnetic field of the solar wind produces an electric field in the solar wind. And well, at least according to Alfvén, I'm kind of using Alfvén's theory of magnetic storms here. So magnetic field of the solar wind produces an electric field in the solar wind, which with the magnetic field of Earth produces a surface charges around the Earth. But well, there's no real surface there, but it's sort of like imaginary surface, like 10 Earth radii from the surface of the Earth. There is this sort of cylindrical shells of charge, or at least quasi-cylindrical, and then they discharge through the magnetic field lines, those space charges, even though that seems like quite a long way away. And that's what we call Birkeland currents, right? But this is only one type of current. I mean, there's also this ring current, which produces magnetic disturbances in the equatorial region. And there is a whole bunch of other currents, like there is plasma drifts in the Earth's environment. We have Van Allen belts that also most likely induce some sort of charge motions, etc. So I would say in general, what we can say is that by induction, all those current systems might produce currents in any point in the Earth and on the Earth. And like, again, if you look at magnetic storms, well, they're driven by currents. Like it's exactly the magnetic field of this Birkeland current, but it's observed everywhere on the planet. I mean, obviously, the closer you are to the poles, the stronger is the disturbance, but still, it's present everywhere nonetheless. And again, well, it might be a bit of a stretch, but we don't really know what kind of field structure there is inside the Earth. Let's say, like, we can observe that it's pretty much approximated by a dipole here. But what happens, let's say, 1,000 kilometers beneath, we have very little understanding. Well, we might just assume that it's the same type of dipole. But again, what if even if we assume, let's say, the current understanding of Earth, well, the motions of the mantle, let's say, they also should be associated with some currents, etc. So, well, basically my point is there are plenty of mechanisms of producing currents everywhere. So it's probably not limited to the poles, at least exclusively. But also, one other thing I wanted to mention is that, well, that would be probably hard to explain, but I'll try. So what I've found in my research is that strong earthquakes like magnitude 8 and above only happen between, let's say, 63 south latitude and 61 north, or vice versa. It's like 60-60, something like that. So it's this belt where these earthquakes happen, but in the polar areas, they almost never happen. So my idea to why was that the case was kind of a continuation of this idea of gold, that it's the, well, again, I'll remind you that gold hypothesized that ionospheric currents might short through the atmosphere and flow through the crust. So my idea was similar, that perhaps it's these field-aligned currents that enter the Earth somewhere in higher latitudes, again, maybe 65 or something like that. So a current enters, let's say in the north, then perhaps it might reach the ground and run through the ground, and then it might exit at 65 south. So that's why where the current runs through the crust, there you get the earthquakes, right? So this is the idea. Because, well, higher than that, it actually already flows outwards or inwards again. So maybe it's actually a good thing that the current enters in the polar areas. That's what I'm saying. Or at least in this, auroral oval, like roughly Arctic circle or Antarctic circle, polar circles.
Yeah. Now, one of the things, obviously, that for me is quite tantalizing is the concept that life itself could exist anywhere. From the idea that these endospores could end up in the ionosphere and then could end up, being sent out on the solar winds, and equally the fact that if microorganisms are much hardier than we believed, and you talked about the microorganisms that can actually use a potential difference to actually sustain themselves. They don't need sunlight or any form of metabolism other than this potential difference. And then it started me thinking, when we look at the interstellar gas clouds, we see some of the components of life. We see some hydrocarbons and things like that. And that kind of made me think, it's a little bit wild, but is it possible? Is it feasible that these microorganisms actually travel between the stars and are actually active within these gas clouds? Or is radiation still one of the biggest hindrances to life once you move outside of that protective bubble that is the Earth?
Well, I don't know. Well, to be honest, like how much of a, let's say, how much of a repair capacities those organisms have, that much I cannot really tell. Like, again, and probably no one can tell, but in terms of transport, I would say that I can easily see how they can travel from the Earth to Mars or Jupiter or whatever. It's not that hard, actually. It might just get. I mean, they're super light. They're like, I don't know how. Damn, I don't really know the estimate of mass for a single cell, but what I know, I've made a calculation once that if a single cell would get like 1,000 extra electrons, and I really hope I'm not screwing this up because somebody might try to replicate this and get a different result, but I think like of the order of 1,000 electrons, extra electrons, I mean the charge, would be enough to lift the bacteria up just in the electric field of Earth. I mean, in the atmosphere. So that's one thing. And well, again, the other thing is that they're just light on their own. So, and if they are charged for some reason, then they would move as charged particles do in the magnetic fields, and they can do all kinds of things since then. I mean, like really, if a bacteria is not charged, then yeah, that would be really hard probably for it to travel anywhere far, because, well, it would have to have at least like 11 kilometers per second of speed just to leave the Earth, and that's really hard to imagine. But if it might be accelerated by electric fields and magnetic fields, etc., well, it's not a problem at all. I mean, in the Earth system, in Earth's magnetosphere, we see like 10 electron volts electrons accelerated to like 10 kilo electron volts. So, and that, well, again, I cannot readily calculate what kind of speeds these are, but that's like perhaps hundreds of kilometers per second or something. So yeah, so you basically need a little bit of charge, and then you can travel anywhere. But in terms of interstellar space, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because if you have charge, you can really follow the magnetic field lines, etc., and the magnetic turbulence and stuff. But at the same time, it actually hinders your motion. So you cannot deviate from that path. You have to stick to it. I remember Alfie in one of his books, he described the interstellar space as almost like syrup for charged particles. So it's sort of dense and sticky for charged particles, I repeat. So they have to move where magnetic fields tell them to. But at the same time, once they're moving there, there's nothing to stop them, basically. So yeah, and in our system, we have solar wind magnetic field lines which connect to everything. So there you go.
But theoretically, so just thinking outside the box, if endospores can be carried up and they can be charged, then just looking at our solar system, it is indeed feasible that we, planet Earth, assuming that planet Earth is the only one that has, life on it, has been seeding endospores, out to the edges of our solar system along the solar winds. Then once it reaches the edge, then it might end up in interstellar space, following some current on a million-year trek to maybe nowhere. Maybe it's gone on somewhere. That then gets me thinking, well, if we can do it, then it's highly possible that this is happening elsewhere as well. So, is space filled with endospores? And in fact, then thinking the other way, was life seeded through that mechanism? But I guess, again, the problem would be, how would you get a charged particle from interstellar space into your bubble around the sun? But for me, the thought here is that life could actually use those highways to spread all the way across the galaxy. Admittedly, you've got to find somewhere that is hospitable enough for you to be able to crack open your ender shell and decide that the time is right to actually do something with it. But it is a very different way of looking at the search for life, because at the moment our search for life is based on certain criteria, whether it's habitable, whether it's got water, whether there's oxygen, blah, blah, blah. Whereas here is what we're saying is actually life could just sit and wait until the conditions arise that actually goes, yeah, okay, I'm ready now.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. Well, I actually mentioned in my paper, and I think you mentioned it in your videos also, quoting me, that if those bacteria, or at least some bacteria, might, or okay, not only bacteria, like any sort of living organism, if it might actually receive its energy from, well, let's say the solar radiation and its nutrients from the solar wind, or some electric current plus some minerals, let's say, then it might exist anywhere, right? Where, at least where those elements are present. And again, they're present in the solar wind in the first place, various elements. So perhaps life doesn't even need any material surface. It might just take all the elements from the interstellar or interplanetary or even intergalactic medium. I don't know. Like, again, all kinds of, like, as time goes on, we find more and more complex molecules in interstellar space and intergalactic space, and it looks very suspicious. Like, it seems like all kinds of stuff is there. It's just like maybe we're not seeing it yet. So yeah, but again, like, unfortunately, I can't really tell much here, because I don't have any special knowledge about this. I don't possess any sort of insights. But one thing I thought about was that maybe I was actually a little bit wrong when I talked about the motion of charged particles, because well, for a single charged particle like a proton or electron, this statement is actually correct. we have them sticking to magnetic field lines pretty solidly, you might say. But if you have a bacteria or just a living cell, which is actually much heavier than a proton or electron, then probably other forces would be important, forces like solar radiation pressure or things like that. So that's one thing I kind of didn't take into account. And inertial forces, like inertia in the first place. So that would probably impact the motion of those endospores or whatever quite a lot. And speaking about that, like, we know that our solar wind shields the solar system from cosmic rays, right? So that only like 10 gigaelectron volts rays can penetrate. But that's only because the gyro radius, so when a charged particle gets into a magnetic field, it starts rotating around this magnetic field, right? So it's just a thing that the gyro radius for a proton of 10 gigaelectron volts in the solar wind magnetic field, so that's maybe 1 nanotesla at the edge of the solar system, it's roughly equal to the radius of the heliosphere itself. So it's it implies that only 10 gigaelectron volts particles or more energetic, which have smaller gyro radius, are able to penetrate, right? Because others are just swing by, so to speak. But if you have a heavier particle, such as, again, a living cell, it would probably have a much smaller gyro radius in the first place. So it would be definitely guided by magnetic fields, especially if we're talking about interstellar distances. But it's not going to be deflected that much if it's going to enter. At least on those scales, it wouldn't be. So that's another factor that we should consider.
Yeah. The Japanese mission, which has landed on an asteroid, fired some thing, shot at it, and then collected it up and is now sending the sample back. I mean, potentially there might be microbes. It depends on how deep into the surface they went. But again, if this idea is correct and life could exist anywhere, then certainly the asteroids, floating around in our solar system may potentially harbor the life. But the question is, I'm not sure that they are going to be testing those samples for life. I suspect they're testing them for other reasons. Is that something that you might actually consider writing to them to ask them to have a look, see if there is life inside of it? Or because problem is their quarantine process might kill anything that was alive before they even get to look at it.
And plus there is re-entry process, which is also not very safe for living. But again, not so sure about that. I mean, maybe life can survive even that. But I'm not sure it's worth to write them. Imagine you're like a scientist maybe Japanese, actually, maybe they would take it more seriously than, say, Europeans would, but or Americans. But maybe one day I'll get drunk and write them a letter or something. But I'm not sure it's necessary. But in general, the issue of life on other bodies, let's say, we have our lunar samples, right? So and actually, again, the astronauts, they've had their sort of quarantine thing, the very first crew, right? Maybe even not only the very first, but maybe a couple of others. I don't quite know. So I don't know what they did then.
You mean how they quarantine them?
Yeah, did they try to do some removal of something? I don't know what they did. But anyway, so perhaps you might say that my theory in this regard, this additional hypothesis that we may have seeded life, kind of fails here, because we have lunar samples of soil and we don't seem to have anything alive in them. But again, did anyone really look for it? I mean, remembering all those things that I've already mentioned, that it's really hard to even culture them, you know, to grow the samples, even the ones taken from Earth, where we definitely know that they are there. But I don't know, like maybe there are actually, living organisms in, let's say, samples taken from comets or asteroids. I don't remember which one. I think it was this Deep Space 2 or something. There was a mission that took cometary samples where they found like high temperature minerals, and everyone was kind of surprised by it. I don't remember which one was that, but anyway, so they did take some samples and they've examined them on Earth. So maybe they just didn't look for it in the first place. That would be my...
There's Mars as well, you know, the highly contentious Viking lander sign of life test, which to this day is still debated whether it was positive or not, whether it was a fault in the machine.
So, but anyway, we haven't had a sample returned from Mars to this day, so we can't really say. Like, I'm not sure. I'm not aware of this Viking mission. What exactly it did?
I think they were testing. I'd have to look it up. They were testing for something which would determine whether in the sample there was something that was alive. So it was but I don't.
So it was like motion.
No. It was a chemical. They were looking for a particular chemical signature, and I don't know what it was. It was some. I'd have to look it up. And the first time they did it, it came as a positive test, and then there was a big hoo-ha about it, and then they claimed that there was a contaminant in the sensor. So someone had touched it, so there was, you know, some oil or something like that from someone's hand, which would then always cause this positive result. So therefore, we had to disregard it. So, but who knows? But I guess even if we look at the future Mars missions, at the moment NASA's focus on looking for life isn't where you would suggest that they should look, because obviously they're looking surface rocks, and the reality is on somewhere like Mars, more likely, like you said, on Earth, that life would start and go down in through those cracks. So it's deeper down that they should be looking.
Well, I don't exclude neither of those scenarios. I mean, I do give the, let's say, I do state this hypothesis that life might actually originate from deep beneath, and then it kind of got up to the surface, but it might have been the other way around. So not quite sure. But by the way, one other thing I wanted to mention is that I'm not even convinced that life actually originated in the first place, either on Earth or anywhere else. It might have existed forever or something, at least as far as I'm concerned, because, well, but that's a long, like, philosophical discussion. But I mean, it's just taking for granted always that, you know, since the universe began, if you know what I mean, then everything else should have began at that point or another. But if the universe didn't begin, then, well, why should anything else have a beginning? Well, it makes sense that it might have a beginning, but on the other hand,
I think we're in agreement in terms of that sort of philosophical point of view, that there is no necessarily beginning or end to it, that it is a continuous process that's been going on forever, and it moves and it changes and it migrates like birds flying, on flocks of them, as they move throughout the universe. And it just so happens that at the moment that it's here, you know, not necessarily just here, but obviously we are very self-centered, and we see ourselves as the only thing that could possibly exist that is anything like this or us, rather than something else that is similar but looks different somewhere else. So, I mean, I agree. But I think what is interesting is the language that NASA uses now in terms of, you know, looking. They're more positive than I've ever seen them looking at it. And there's the cynic in you, or the conspiracy theorist that says, well, they found it tens of years ago and they're just really finding a way to release it. But there are viable candidates, not just Mars. You've got Europa, is Ganymede. There's various, Titan as well, I suppose, to some, where, looking at those examples that you've talked about in your paper, they could well survive in those conditions, because there are currents that potentially do flow. There are minerals that they could feed off. It's just that, we've been so blindfolded in terms of how we look for life, that I think that's, for me, is one of the reasons I quite like the paper, is because it kind of, it opens all of that up, the tenacity of life itself to survive in almost any sort of condition, really. It's just our inability to see it that has hindered us. Every time we look further, oh, there's another one, and every time we look deeper, oh, look, there's something else. So that, for me,
Yeah.
is the beauty of that paper, I think, just reminding people of that fact.
Yeah, with regards to this whole issue of detection, of inability to grow those samples, to culture them, as they say, there's actually a term that they've coined recently, like a few years ago, and it's a very funny term because it's literally biological or microbial dark matter. That's how they call it.
Beautiful.
It's those organisms that we know they are there, but we cannot detect them, basically. And it's a thing. You might Google that, and you'll find several papers at least that discuss this. And it's about our inability to cultivate them, to breed them, if you like, in the lab. But we definitely see that they're there. But the problem is that to study them, we need more of them, and we just can't get more of them because they don't want to eat and replicate. So they remain this unexplored dark matter.
Oh, beautiful that they use the word dark matter.
Yeah.
So in terms of the paper now, what are your sort of thoughts on taking that forward?
Well, as I've said, but I need probably a few months just not to do anything at all with it. But because, well, I've sent it to this Journal of Geophysical Research, Biogeosciences, but I mean, I've sent it there only to have an excuse to upload it to this preprint server, because I was convinced that they wouldn't publish it, and they've rejected it. Like literally maybe a week ago, I got a letter from them, but I wasn't surprised. I mean, I was writing it already knowing that, so I wasn't fitting it to be published. So I was just very open in my thoughts. So at the very beginning, so I'm not really surprised. But anyway, at the moment, I think I would need a few months just to think about it a bit more and maybe wait for some new info. And then perhaps I will publish this other smaller paper with more practical things. Again, maybe a proposal for those experiments that we talked about. Like maybe there's first point, maybe we can grow those microorganisms better if we feed them currents instead of sugar or whatever. The second point is that we might send currents through them and see if that initiates any kinetic response. And the third is vice versa. Maybe we should shake them and see if they produce a current. So those are three experiments that we might do. Or, well, by we, I mean humanity, because I definitely can't do that. I don't have those samples. They're pretty rare. I'm not sure if they're like, what are they doing with them at the moment, but they somewhere. But again, the question might be about the quantity. Maybe this quantity that they have would not be enough for what I've proposed, because, well, if there's like 100 cells total, maybe they wouldn't do anything, because, well, again, this drilling, it was mostly done like away from the fault lines. So again, according to my hypothesis, it's probably more of those organisms that I talk about would be situated near fault lines or right in them. So maybe if you drill somewhere else, those would be completely different microorganisms or something. Or at least there would be not as much of them as needed for any sort of response like that to happen. But who knows? I mean, maybe somebody would listen to me and they would try to do that and they would find something. Well, that's a possibility. So this is, so far, I'm not sure what I'm going to be thinking like a month from now, but so far this is my best bet, is another small paper with those proposals, and maybe also again, I've already aware of Thomas Gold's paper, which I wasn't aware before. Then I'm aware of this other paper that I mentioned about the shaking and voltage differences. I'll also send you the link to it. So there's a whole bunch of other things that came out, or at least I became aware of after I've submitted the paper. So maybe I'll need some enhancement of a theoretical sort. Maybe I'll come up with some other ideas. I don't know. Maybe someone else will come up with ideas in the comments to this video.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
Well, thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and I wish you all the success in that paper. And maybe we'll do a follow-up to this, in maybe 6 months' time or a year's time, once you've developed the paper a bit further or got input from other people. Because personally, I think for me, it was definitely an eye-opener. It was one of those things, refreshing sort of, again, reminder of the tenacity of life and the fact that we need to be looking with different eyes when we look at some of these things. So thank you very much for your time, Eugene.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. And yeah, well, those videos of yours definitely inspired me to kind of look another time at what I did and revisit it. And again, some of the people in your comment section are proposing pretty interesting things. So thanks to them also. So thank you.